In this exam, you have to translate a passage from the Middle English text into modern English. I had modules on science. We actually took a trip to the Globe Theatre to see 2 plays performed. I did an essay on Alexander Pope and versification and landscape gardening in his works. You do not get to bring the text into your exams with you. You need to memorize all of your quotations. Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. Emma here. I hope you're all doing really well. First of all, I'd like to start this video by saying congratulations to everybody who's just received their A-level results and who will be off to university this September. This is such an exciting time for everybody and I really can't wait for you. And that said, you can probably tell by the title of this video that I'm going to be talking about the Cambridge English Literature course today. A lot of you asked for this video and I've sort of been putting off, but I do think that this is the best time to film a video like this, especially with a lot of people who will have found out their A-level results and will be off to study English at Cambridge, and for those of you who are beginning the application cycle this year and are applying to university. So I thought I'd just sort of sit down, talk to you about the course, give you a little bit more information, talk about my personal experience with the course, the kind of texts I'd written on, the kind of themes we'd discovered, and the overall teaching of the course. So I think I'd like to start with the overall course content before moving on to how content and texts are taught at Cambridge specifically, because it's a little bit different at Oxford and Cambridge than at other universities. So with that said, let's get started. So as with any university English course, the English course at Cambridge is 3 years long. This is pretty standard, and at Cambridge we refer to a 3-year course as tripos, three years, you get it. But it's also broken up into 2 parts at Cambridge. So years 1 and 2 is classed as part 1, and year 3, your final year, is classed as part 2. And I know you might be wondering, why is it broken into 2 parts when it's a 3-year course? But that's just how it is at Cambridge, because the first 2 years cover a whole range of literary periods and literary texts from medieval to present day, whereas in your final year you start to specialise more and pick out maybe modules that are more suited to you, and you can tailor the course a little bit more based on your preferences. So let's start with part 1. So as I've said, in part 1 you will study a range of texts from the medieval period to present day, which is what drew me to the English literature course at Cambridge more than any other university specifically, because I didn't really know what time period I was interested in and which authors I'd specifically like to study. So having these first 2 years to just explore and learn as much as I can and work out like where my preferences lay or where my interests lay was really, really important and fundamental to me for shaping those choices in my final year. So this timeline is then broken up into papers that you will sit based on their dates. So I actually have a list of the papers written out here, and they are all named English Literature and its contexts plus the date, or the date range, the time period that you're studying. So first up is English Literature and its contexts 1066 to 1350, or otherwise known as the early medieval period. Most people tend not to study this because obviously you'll need to know how to read early English texts in a very different language, but you can take that paper if you feel like you're up to the challenge, or you have an interest in it, or you have studied something related to this before and think you'd be suited to that paper. Next up is 1300 to 1500, otherwise known as the medieval paper. This is the compulsory one. Then we have the early modern period, or 1500 to 1700. After that is the sort of late Renaissance moving into the Victorian Romantic period. There is a lot of overlap between these papers, so this kind of covers a broad timeline from 1660 to 1870. Next up is the sort of Victorian into modern period, and that's 1830 to 1945. And finally is the sort of modern into postmodern period, and that's 1870 to present day. Most colleges will follow this timeline chronologically, but some colleges do it a little bit differently depending on who they can get to teach you in certain terms. But the way I did it, I studied medieval in my first term, Renaissance in my second term, and Shakespeare in my third term of first year, and then I studied 2 other papers in my second year, which I'll get onto in a little bit, but I actually didn't sit examinations on those papers. They were more coursework based. So let's start with my first year. In your first year, or if you studied these texts in your first year. The medieval and Shakespeare papers are actually compulsory for everybody. You have to sit these papers. They're sort of fundamental in how literature is shaped. There are also some set texts that you need to study within these papers, which is why everybody will sit them. On top of that, it's also compulsory that everybody sits a paper called Practical Criticism and Critical Practice. Bit of a mouthful, I know, but we shorten it to PracCrit. If you've done unseen texts at school, it's a bit like that exam you sit, where you will be given extracts from different texts from different times in history. It could be a poem, it could be a biography, it could be a piece of prose, it could be anything. And in this exam, you will sort of go through, pick out the questions you want to answer, and then come up with your analysis on the spot and write an essay with no, you know, outer context, no preparation for this exam, other than sort of practicing getting used to analysing on the spot without having done a lot of research and gone away and read essays. So that is the third compulsory paper that you have to sit in part 1 of the Tripos. Now moving on from PracCrit, I'll talk about medieval, because obviously that was my first paper. Now in the medieval paper there is a compulsory text that you need to study. Obviously this might change over the years and the course might change a little bit, so I'm just talking about my personal experience of the course whilst I was at Cambridge. But when I studied the medieval paper, it was compulsory to study a text called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is a brilliant text. I can definitely recommend it. If you don't know how to read Middle English, go away and get a translated version. But if you're like preparing to go and study English at university, it's just a really great text to study anyway, to get yourself prepared for maybe a Middle English paper if you know you'll be sitting that. In this exam, you have to translate a passage from the Middle English text Sir Gawain into modern English. So that was one of the tasks that we had to do in our exam, and it could be any sort of stanza from the poem in chapter 4. Sounds daunting, I know, but you have plenty of teaching and preparation for it, and by the time the exam rolled around, that was probably the part of the paper I was most prepared for, because it's something you actually can study for. You can memorize a translation, you can look up words in the dictionary, make sure you have flashcards to know what the Middle English words mean and, you know, their modern English equivalent. So that was the first compulsory part of the paper. The second compulsory part was that you needed to do a sort of in-depth analysis of a specific part of Chaucer's famous poem Troilus and Cresside. So this was partially translation and partial analysis. You needed to know things like allusions outside of the text, specific references, quite niche references about maybe astrology or the gods, and they might give you a small extract again in this exam and just ask you to analyse parts of the passage, translate parts of the passage. They might ask you what a specific phrase is referring to, or a specific word that's a little bit unusual and was sort of niche to Chaucer's time and that we wouldn't really use today. And then for the rest of the exam, you can write essays on any text that you're interested in and any text you've chosen to study. So the Cambridge course is pretty unique in this way, in that you can shape your own course by picking out the text you want to study and talking it through with your supervisor. This is the person or the professor who will oversee your work and will help you to write your essays. And you can say, oh, I went to this lecture on this text and this really interested me, I'd like to write an essay on it this week. Or I read this text and then saw in the footnote that it referenced this text, so I went away and read these and like to write an essay on this. So I've actually written down a couple of names of the essays that I'd written to share with you, so you can know the sort of themes that you can write on or the sort of text you can write on. But really this is so open-ended and you can sort of discuss anything you want. So a couple of the essays I'd written on were disease and dis-ease in Troilus and Cresside, staging and stagecraft in the morality plays, heroism and the ordinary in Henryson's fables, or excess in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So that's just such a wide range of different themes or ideas you can look at in text, but some people can look at something completely different to what I'd read. So next up, I mentioned the Renaissance paper, and this was a really interesting term for me. Again, you can sort of choose whatever you like, and my supervisor for this paper actually put on a couple of really cool, interesting classes for us. For example, we practiced writing letters letters and sealing them with a wax stamp. We took a trip to see some of the old architecture around Cambridge, just to sort of inform our study of Renaissance texts. Again, what I really loved about the Cambridge English course is that it's so interdisciplinary. So what I mean by that is it's not just about English literature. You can choose to incorporate history, philosophy, politics. I had modules on science in the Renaissance era. We took a trip to the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge and got to see like the miniature portraits and some like really old medieval manuscripts, for example. There is such a wealth of information and resources available when studying at Cambridge that maybe isn't available at other universities, because they have, you know, their copyright libraries and their museums, and they have a lot of artifacts like this. What I mean by a copyright library is that the university library, which is accessible to all students from all subjects, has every single text that has ever been copyrighted in that library or in a unit that they can source for you. So you can literally study some of the most niche things that are out there that maybe nobody has even looked at before. And I just find that so amazing and so shocking and surprising and exciting all at the same time. So I would definitely recommend like going to check out the library or the museums if you do get into Cambridge. Even if you're not studying English, even if you're just interested in what's out there, definitely go and take a look sometime across your degree. And again, some of the things that I did write about in my Renaissance paper included court culture and fashioning a gentleman in the Fairy Queen, language and authority in the works of Marlowe, stuff and materiality in Thomas Nash's Lenten Stuff, the idea of new worlds in Margaret Cavendish's Blazing World and Aphra Behn's Orinoco. Like, you can really sort of study whatever you want, as I've said. It might be the case that your supervisor says one week, I'd prefer it if you all looked at a similar cluster of texts so we can all discuss it together. I think it would really inform your study, or this is a really fundamental text of the period. But for the most part, you have the freedom in all the other weeks that you're there to pick whatever you want. So next up, and by far one of my favourite papers of the Cambridge English course, was the Shakespeare paper. Now, I know a lot of you might dislike Shakespeare, or maybe you didn't take a liking to him in school because it was taught to you in a really dry way, or you didn't understand the language, but listening to the lecturers speak about Shakespeare at Cambridge was one of my most memorable experiences throughout my whole degree. It made me appreciate and love Shakespeare. We actually took a trip to the Globe Theatre to see 2 plays performed, which was just the most amazing experience ever, especially for someone who's from up north and hasn't had an opportunity like that before. This was my first time going to see something in the theatre, in the Globe, so that was a really, really exciting moment for me. And, you know, you learn about completely new interpretations of Shakespeare that you never would have looked at school. For example, when you're studying plays and texts at school, you might be set off to research different themes in the play. For example, the theme of power in Hamlet, or morality, or I don't know, the feminist theory or the psychoanalytical theory or approach to this text. At Cambridge, it's slightly different. Lecturers present to you based on what they're researching at the time. So, for example, my year group might have been the only year group to have heard a specific lecture series, or it might run for a certain amount of years but be completely different when you start studying there, because they're constantly researching the newest, most exciting thread in theory at the time. So in that sense, you're always getting something new and relevant and modern. Again, like the medieval paper, there is actually a set text with the Shakespeare paper, and that is Cymbeline, one of Shakespeare's lesser known late plays or romantic plays. So you might not have heard that. Go away and read it if you are interested or you do like Shakespeare. And in that part of the exam, you need to be able to gloss a passage from the play, and that sort of means, you know, when you have sort of footnotes that accompany a Shakespeare text that might explain what a certain word means, or explain a historical reference that Shakespeare might be making, or an allusion to another text, you need to be able to remember these glosses or these notes and do that yourself in the exam. They'll give you a passage and they might underline a sentence or underline a word, and you'd have to be able to say, this is what this word means, or this is the historical event that Shakespeare is referencing in this line. But again, you'll have plenty of training in that, so you'll be more than prepared for it in your exam. And again, the text might change over the years. In fact, I think they might actually be removing that exercise from the newest course, but don't quote me on that. But again, some of the essays that I wrote about in the Shakespeare paper included empire, nationalism and identity in Cymbeline with references to Brexit, textuality, materialism, publication and commodity fetishization in Romeo and Juliet and Love's Labour's Lost, which again, you know, it's not your sort of normal drab themes of love or power in Romeo and Juliet that you might be used to at school. It's something that you might never have considered, or a theory you'd never heard of before. The next one was Louis Althusser's theory of interpolation and Henry IV part 1 and 2, and the idea of theatricality and sort of stagecraft and staging as well. Some of the other cool essays included The Sense of Self in Richard II and Hamlet, and Sound and the Body in The Winter's Tale. Obviously these are sweeping generalizations as to what my essays were really about. I've just picked out key themes that I talked about, but it was definitely a lot more in-depth than that, and I might have discussed some really detailed quotations or critical theories, but these are just sort of the overarching themes of the essays that I'd written. Next up, I'm going to talk about year 2. So this is still part 1 of the course, but again moving along that chronological timeline. And in this year, I actually didn't sit any papers for examination. They were all coursework based. That said, you do have the freedom at Cambridge to say, rather than submitting a piece of coursework, I'd rather sit this as an exam, but most people do go for the coursework route. I think the dissertation is definitely compulsory in your second year, but I'm not too sure about the portfolio. So obviously a dissertation is a long essay. In this case it was 5,000 words, so not as long as maybe like a thesis that you would do in your final year or for a master's project, but a sort of longer essay than what you're used to writing in your weekly essays or in an examination. And the portfolio of essays is 3 shorter essays, I think of around 2,000 words, that you need to submit together. And these pieces of coursework are substitutes for sitting an exam. So the texts you study still have to fit into one of these period papers. You just don't sit in an examination on it, you're submitting coursework instead. So I'll start with my first term of second year, where I wrote a dissertation on Gerard Manley Hopkins, a poet that I was really interested in and that my supervisor had suggested to me at the end of my first year to study, where I wrote about sprung rhythm and religion and philology and the way language evolves and changes, and the idea of like an Adamic language or a purer language that we were slipping away from, the idea of language being lost or corrupted, and that sort of idea entwined with religion, which was something I was really interested in throughout my degree and throughout my A-levels. So I said to my supervisors I'd really like to write a dissertation on poetics, rhythm, meter, and they helped brainstorm ideas with me at the end of my first year as to what I could study going into my second year for my dissertation. I did do some planning for this in the summer before coming to Cambridge for my second year, so that I already had maybe some text read, I knew what direction I'd be heading in, I'd maybe written half of it already. A lot of it got scrapped in the end, but a lot of it did stay as well, so just having that initial idea and some ideas written down on paper that I'd played with a little bit and knew that this topic was sort of meaty enough to write on. And that was in substitute for the 1830 to 1945 paper, moving from Victorian into, or late Victorian into the modern period. Obviously I went super early at that timeline at late Victorian, but it still just slipped into that paper. And then for my second term of second year, I did my portfolio of essays, and this was in substitute for that 1660 to 1870 paper. So we're talking sort of late Renaissance moving into the maybe more Victorian Romantic period. I think I did an essay on Tennyson's In Memoriam to do with maybe religion and creation, or the universe, or how the universe functioned like clockwork or something. I did another essay on Maria Edgecombe's Belinda and children's writings, and something to do with how children were taught in this period, I think. Again, this was quite a long time ago for me now, so I'm sort of trying to grasp at what it might have been on. And what was my third essay? Yes, I did an essay on Alexander Pope, who is a poet, and versification and landscape gardening in his works, which sounds so strange and unusual, but this is what I mean by you can literally study anything. And I think I talked about how his poems and the verse and the rhythm of walking through the poem was like walking through a landscape garden, and each line sort of took us up to a vantage point, just as you would if you were walking through a country garden, which when I look back on it, I'm like, that is such a random topic, but that is where my weird brain took me, and my research and my discussions with lecturers and supervisors and things. Now, you might notice that I haven't mentioned any specific teaching for the practical criticism and critical practice paper. That's because this doesn't get a term on its own. This is something you're continuously learning throughout your time at Cambridge. So you will constantly go to lectures on this, you will constantly have classes on this. Every other week you might write a short essay on this, shorter than your weekly essay. And ultimately you're learning the skills as you go anyway, whilst you're learning your period papers or studying for them, and you are also examined on this at the end of the year. So you might have noticed also that I didn't mention third term. That's because third term at the Cambridge English course in your second year is reserved for studying. So you need to revise all of these papers, you need to make sure you know which text you're going to use, you need to know which quotes you're going to use, because unlike school, you do not get to bring the text into your exams with you. You need to memorize all of your quotations, which again sounds really daunting, but it's a lot easier than you might think, especially when you've been living in these texts for 2 years. So at the end of my first 2 years at Cambridge, I sat an exam in medieval, Renaissance, Shakespeare and practical criticism, and obviously I'd already submitted my portfolio and dissertation as coursework that made up for the rest of my mark. And that is how we end second year. That wraps that up. So let's move on to third year. Now, as I've said, the third year at Cambridge is very much your own. You can personalise it as you want, you can pick the papers you want. There are lots of optional papers to choose from. So the way that the third year works is that there are 2 compulsory papers. That is the tragedy paper and again another practical criticism and critical practice paper. On top of that, you will also have your optional papers. I've written some of the coolest sounding ones out. So some of them might include the medieval supernatural, the material Renaissance, lyric, American, post-colonial, visual culture, love, gender, sexuality, and the ethical imagination. And those are just a few. There are so many more papers to choose from, and you know, it might be the case that you take a paper that everybody takes and there might be 30 people in your class, or you might take a paper that is maybe less popular and there are only 2 people in your class. But the whole point is that you have a range of options to choose from to make sure you are tailoring your educational experience to your interests based on what you've learned in your first 2 years. Now, from this list, you will choose 2 papers to study and write 1 dissertation, or you will choose 1 paper to study and write 2 dissertations. And the dissertations don't have to be on any of the specific optional papers, unlike your second year. They can be on anything you want. So that the second option is what I chose to do because I knew I preferred long research projects. I loved writing dissertations, I loved the in-depth research of it, and I didn't particularly like sitting exams. But obviously there is more to it than just, you know, sitting exams and disliking sitting exams, because everybody dislikes exams, but you might perform better in that kind of environment, or your best ideas might come to you in that kind of environment, which might steer you towards that instead, or you might struggle with time management and independent research, which might put you off that route. But personally, I really wanted to do 2 dissertations and 1 paper. So on top of my prac crit and my tragedy papers, I decided to take the lyric paper, and for my 2 dissertations I decided to do 1 on medieval lyric poetry and another one on Ezra Pound's cantos and rhythm, meter, language and translation. Now, I'm not going to focus too much on my dissertations because they were very individual or personal to me, but I will talk about the tragedy paper and I can dip briefly into the lyric paper, but again, there are a wide range of options available. That was just something I was very, very interested in. So the tragedy paper, and I can say this up with Shakespeare, or maybe above Shakespeare, was my favourite paper to study at Cambridge. I don't want to sound dramatic, but I do feel like it changed me as a person. Or it changed my world views a lot, or it opened my mind quite a lot, because tragedy is such a broad paper. In this paper, it's compulsory to write about Greek tragedies and Shakespearean tragedies. So I spent my summer before the third year reading every Greek tragedy and every Shakespearean tragedy that was ever written. I think there are 30 Greek tragedies by Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides. And then I read some of Shakespeare's tragedies, maybe the ones that I didn't touch touch upon in my first year at Cambridge to try and broaden my knowledge of Shakespeare and tragedy. But the idea of tragedy is quite broad, so it didn't need to just be what was classed as Shakespeare's tragedies. It could also include some of his late plays, his comedies could even be viewed as tragedies, and some of his history plays as well are definitely tragic. So the idea of the tragedy paper is that tragedy is what you make it. Tragedy is however you define it, however scholars define it, and if you can justify that that text is a tragedy, then you are more than welcome to write about it as a tragedy. You can write about prose, poetry, fiction, non-fiction, plays, newspaper articles. You are open to write about whatever you want. And again, as I've said before, it's super interdisciplinary, so I could write about philosophical theories of tragedy, I could write about history and philosophy and politics, and it's multimedia as well. I could write about art and tapestries and vases and YouTube videos, films, music, songs, whatever I wanted to write about. I found this paper so, I don't know, life-changing, because you are learning about real life events, real life tragedies that are happening today in this world. Obviously, as I was studying for this paper, coronavirus was sweeping the world. We were living through a real life tragedy, so you can draw upon anything you want to answer essay questions about tragedy. You can play with what the definition of tragedy is. You can draw upon different theories from Aristotle or modern philosophers. You can draw on Nietzsche and Hegel and any text you can find, or any text that you are interested in, and you can argue against them or use it to support your argument of tragedy. And I think this paper for me was just the most feeling, or the most real, because it felt most relevant to today's world. It wasn't sort of living in the fantasy fairyland of, you know, Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen anymore, or in the supernatural world of dragons and knights from the medieval period. We were talking about real life tragedies of today and how to approach them, about empathy, about grief, about staging tragedy versus real world tragedy. And I actually ended up writing my essay exams on the refugee crisis, and you know, it really felt like I was using the text I'd studied to inform my real world view of tragedy and of what is happening around us, and it really grounded me in the real world as well. So it wasn't that I was just living in text, but I was using text to inform how I was living. So some of the themes I talked about were language, sound and silence, refugees, vengeance, grief, dispossession, fragmentation, miscommunication and identity. I handpicked the text that I really wanted to study. I could definitely recommend Zong is a brilliant text about slavery. It's a very strange and fragmented poem, but so beautiful and moving. I studied Drift by Caroline Bergvall, which again was another text about refugees and identity and language. I watched operas and dances as well. There was just so much out there, and my tragedy paper would have been completely different to the next person's tragedy paper, because you make it what you want it. And then quickly to touch upon the lyric paper, that was about lyric poetry, but again that's one of these big concepts like tragedy, and we often explored what does lyric mean, what is a lyric poem, does it have to be musical, does it have to talk in the first person, does it have to you know, have this lyric I, does it have to be in a certain tense. There were so many questions about what lyric is and what lyric contains to be a lyric, and obviously as ever it's always an undecided argument, an unsettled answer. And I talked about a whole range of texts. I talked about Langston Hughes and jazz poetry and the Harlem Renaissance and black communities and how they shaped themselves through lyric poetry. I talked about possession and the supernatural in Shelley's poetry and Swinburne's poetry, and how a voice inhabits your body as you read a lyric poem, and that's akin to a supernatural possession. I talked about space as in like physical space, metaphorical space, the physical space on the page, like, or the mise en page. I also talked about dialect poetry, which was really important to me as someone from Newcastle. I was really keen to research how we can express dialect or identity in lyric poetry, if there are specific ways of writing or specific characters we can use to try and express dialect through poetry, dialect terminology, and the idea of a language that's dying out and how we can preserve that in text. So that ends my 3 years at Cambridge. That is the overall course. Now I'd like to briefly touch upon the teaching at Cambridge. So I've mentioned a couple of times about supervisors and lectures, but Cambridge and Oxford are slightly different to other universities in the sense that they offer a more unique style of teaching. So they offer lectures, which every university will offer. There might be a couple of hundred of you sitting in the lecture hall with a lecturer standing at the front with maybe a presentation going, telling you about it, and it's not very interactive. You sit and you write notes. You might ask a question or two at the end once it's finished, but you're more likely to just leave that lecture and digest that information in your own time. Cambridge also offers seminars, which are small group teachings. There might be a couple of texts to read beforehand. You might have to come with a presentation prepared to deliver to your peers. You might be given more text at a seminar to discuss. It's sort of more conversational, back and forth, more of a group discussion. You're all sharing your ideas, debating with each other, disagreeing with each other, supporting one another's arguments. And that can seem really scary at first, but I think once you get comfortable with the people who are in your seminar, then you can start to open up and really share your ideas and change the way one another see texts, or inspire one another to go away and look at certain texts they might not have considered before. But here's where Cambridge is slightly different. Cambridge offers small group teaching, or maybe one-on-one teaching, called supervisions. This is even smaller than a seminar. There might be, say, 10 to 20 of you in a seminar, but in a supervision there will only be maybe maximum 4 of you to a minimum of one-on-one with the supervisor. At the Cambridge English course, you will write a weekly essay that you hand into your supervisor the day before or a couple of days before your supervision, and they will mark that, read it, come up with some discussion points, and you will turn up and you will discuss your essay specifically with your supervisor. They will tell you what they liked, what they disagreed with, what you could have researched more, a really interesting idea you talked about but didn't really elaborate, and they might push you to go and read more texts or explore that idea a little bit more. So it's really, really tailored and personal based on what you're interested in and what you've written on. And I think this kind of teaching worked really, really well for me because I needed to know constantly how I was doing. I liked this personalized feedback to sort of let my creative imagination open up and to push me in certain directions I never would have considered going in before. And I think this way, by having personalized feedback, positives and constructive criticism, it really helped me to believe in myself, but also to improve myself and to improve my writing style. I feel like I definitely developed my own individual tone of voice that was quite distinctive to me. I developed my own distinctive interests, and as I say, like, my essays would have been completely different to anybody else. We all had our own style that was very, very different to that sort of methodical writing style you'll have during your GCSEs and your A-levels at school, where it's very formulaic. You might do point, evidence, explain, or whatever. It's very, very different at university. So that is that. I hope this has really helped you to understand the Cambridge English course, to understand how it's taught and how much flexibility and freedom you do have if you didn't already realize that. I know sometimes it's difficult to know what to prepare for, what's coming, but I think it's comforting to know that there is no one way of preparing, and because it's so open, it's best to just read widely and openly and follow your interests. So best of luck to anybody who is off to study English or off to study at Cambridge. I hope you have the best 3 or 4 or however many years of your life. Please let me know what you're up to in the comments below, and let me know if this has helped you as well. Best of luck, everybody. Goodbye.